Game over. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to episode 523 for February 26, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
And I'm Jay Ledbetter.
Thanks for joining us this week, everybody. Fellas, how you doing? You guys have
A
a
little
good week?
trashy. Feeling a little trashy right now.
Feeling a
Oh,
little
ready to go
trashy?
dumpster diving. Let's go, brother.
All right. Yeah, as we start off this show, Jay, you have some explaining to do. Because this is your idea. And I thought, you know what? You know what would be a fun exercise? Let's throw this out on social media. Let's get everyone on Twitter's responses for their favorite movies that maybe aren't very good, but you love anyway. And my God, by some of those responses, you would have thought I was hitting people's grandmas in the face. That I was attacking them personally just by suggesting the very topic.
One man's trash is another person's treasure. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
I guess so. So, Jay, you have to explain this to everybody, why you thought this was a good idea and why we're talking about it today, because I don't want to have to deal with
I want to make it clear. I am not the be-all, end-all arbiter of what our show will be about. This is a working document, much like the U.S. Constitution. You can amend said document. However, it just appears that we settled on favorite movies that are absolute trash based on, the epic cocaine bear that is taking America by storm this week. So let's go dumpster diving. That's what I say. Let's do it. And I'm interested because the way that you kind of phrase that is interesting to me because I think there is that thing where you're like, I know this movie is bad and I like it. And I think the other side of a trash movie is like, this movie has no intentions of being anything but trash, but it does it really well.
Which ones are actually self-aware in that regard, and which ones do it well? Because there are examples of movies that try to be that and kind of fail at that. Movies that try to achieve the cult status thing.
Yeah.
When you kind of realize that achieving cult status is usually an accident. That's
do
usually
it.
not the goal to have in mind when you make a movie. And when you try to do that, you sometimes fall on your face. And there are movies that do try
the
to be a
Sharknado
little
problem.
That's kind of
Trying
the actual
to
official. It's the
make
official term for
yourself an ironic movie.
Right,
kind of.
right.
Yeah.
Well, I tried to articulate that the best I could to some individuals on Twitter, but they weren't having it. They thought this whole idea was a slap in the face, apparently.
Was it the use of the word trash? I guess
I don't know. I didn't see. I avoided that term specifically. I didn't really phrase it that way, but I tried to articulate it that sometimes these are just movies that aren't very good, regardless of how you get there, intentionally or unintentionally, ironically or unironically. But movies that aren't very good, but you still love anyway. And a lot of the pushback I got was, well, if you liked it, then it achieved what it was trying to do, therefore it's good. Which I don't fundamentally agree with that notion, but I do understand it, I guess.
It can be a case-by-case thing. Some movies, as we just talked about, might have that goal in mind, and then we can, praise it a bit more objectively in that regard. But sometimes they don't. And I feel like in this conversation, we're going to talk about films that sort of maybe scratch all of those check boxes in their own respective ways.
Well, and
I will
and
say
think,
this. In this instance, I use the word trash with great reverence. I am not
trash
meaning
doesn't
to
necessarily be it doesn't have to be a
belittle these
negative in
movies.
this regard.
You can be a great piece of junk, and that's what we're talking about here today. The classic dumpster whoppers that you find at 3 a.m. in the morning after a night out on the town.
I think I remember
you're
the first time you made that analogy was when you and Ryan talked about the reboot of Hellboy.
Yeah, a movie
film,
that I was
you used
this
the McDonald's
movie is
analogy.
such junk, but I kind of admire its adherence to junkiness.
Right.
And I think there's something to be said for that. So,
Yeah.
Which I never did see, but I don't know if that movie or another one that I know you've associated that term with, Jay, is the Aquaman movie that came out in 2018 or whatever.
That's dumpster filet mignon right there.
It's so big and so glossy. I feel like it almost like surpasses what we're talking about here.
But that's what makes it interesting, though, because I don't know if those movies are aiming to be something like a Cocaine Bear, for example, which knows what it is. Those films are accidentally dumpster whoppers, I guess, because they're not. I can't imagine that Warner Brothers set out to make this giant DC superhero movie to be nothing more than, a trashy dumpster burger. Like, I don't think that was necessarily the case, which is why this conversation certainly has some nuance to it. And to those that do push back on it, the best way for me to articulate this, which hopefully I conveyed on social media, who knows, maybe I failed miserably and you guys can help fill in the gaps, but because obviously art is subjective.
Right.
And I think a lot of what this conversation boils down to is, yes, a little bit of subjective and objective, but from your perspective. Right. Whatever it is, whatever your parameters are, how you define, how you constitute good art, whatever that is, these are the movies that do not adhere to those definitions. They fall below those expectations, and yet we still love them anyway. So there is a little bit of separation between subjectivity and objectivity, but based on your singular definitions of what that means specifically. So it's not as if we're drawing hard lines in the sand of this is what's good art and this is bad art. And
we're not even necessarily going to say that these are quote unquote bad movies. I mean, there might be some examples where we do talk about ones that try to achieve that sort of campy status or whatever it might be, and maybe they just do it really well. That's
what
be another
mine are mostly.
Really? Yeah. Mine are kind of a mixed
successful versions of this, I think.
Yeah, and maybe this is like the portion of the conversation where we talk about criteria, because mine's sort of a mixture of all the above. I've got a few here that maybe I'll chalk up to nostalgia that I'll own up and say are terrible movies in their own right, but there's something about them that just still sticks with me. But there are aspects of what you just said, Jay, in my list. I've got some here that I think are trying to achieve that sort of mentality and do a good job at it.
Yeah. And I think that distinction needs to be made, because I'm sure even among this conversation, there will be films brought up where I push back to go, hey, I by my definition of what I think is good, I would actually say that film you're bringing up is good. Yeah. And vice versa. Fair. That could very well happen as well. So there's room for subjectivity all around. It really comes down to where you personally draw that line. So if we bring up a film and I say that I don't think this film is bad, I'm not saying that that you should also think that it's bad. Right. It's just not very good based off of my definition of what I think good art is. Right. These films fall below that threshold. And that's perfectly fine, because for reasons we'll get into, I still enjoy them anyway. So hopefully that makes sense.
I think so.
What we're doing
I think we cleared the air, so to speak.
Yes. We'll have a review of Cocaine Bear coming very soon as well. As of this recording, only one of us has seen that film, so we won't speak to it in this conversation. But let's go ahead and dive into this. Again, talking about movies that are trash. A word that Jay threw out there, but we actually love that we like. So where do you guys want to begin? I guess we'll go with you, Jay. What are some films you want to bring up here to kick this off?
So every morning I wake up, I bend down, say my morning prayers to the patron saints of trash, of contemporary trash, of course, who are Neville Dean and Taylor.
There are a few directors I knew you were going to call attention to, and these guys were among them. I knew it.
Mark Neville Dean and Brian Taylor, they started the 2000s with a string of films that are meant to be offensive and off-putting and sophomoric in many regards and piss people off. And if they have your sensibilities, fill you with so much joy that you will very rarely have as fun a time watching a movie as you do watching their films. And their two magnum opuses are the Crank films, Crank and Crank High Voltage, which to me, if anybody just says, hey, do you want to put Crank on? I'm like, tell me when, tell me where. I'm running. I will meet you there.
6-pack in hand.
Do it. Yes.
Probably more of a 12-pack if you're going to do both movies in one day.
And mysteriously, I don't know how this happened. My wife loves the Crank movies. I don't know why or how, but she's a big Jason Statham fan. But Crank and Crank 2 are films that have they put no thought into whether or not the audience will like something. They are saying this is a very specific sensibility that we are portraying on the screen, and it is going to be something that is going to really, really put you off, or you are going to wholly embrace it. And I wholly embrace those films. I think they are hysterical. I think the action in them is fantastic. Statham has never been better than he is in those Crank movies. And if you haven't seen the Crank movies, the first film is about Chev Chelios, a hitman whose heart is stolen. Or no, in the first one, he's injected with a poison that if his heart rate drops, he will die.
Right.
And he has to give himself like adrenaline all the time, whether that's from, actual adrenaline shots or doing stunts or having sex in public, maybe at certain points. That might happen. But that's the bend of the first one. Then the second one takes it to an entirely different level where it has like disembodied heads in tanks that can talk, and it has a Godzilla style kaiju fight where Jason Statham is in this. The Jason Statham character turns into this giant foam like Godzilla costume character fighting in a giant city. It's amazing. But in that film, they take his heart and replace it with an artificial heart that requires an electric charge. So you see him in that movie, like he'll get the car wires and put him on his tongue and like electrocute himself so that his heart can go back into back to beating. So
I mean, how do you get better than that? Like that is a pitch. Like when you go to a studio and pitch something like that, you're gonna get funded.
I mean, they've been teasing a third one forever. I know Statham wants it to happen. Neville Dean and Taylor have made some other movies too. Gamer is like this really fascinating. That movie is like kind of hard to watch. It's so off-putting, but it actually has some kind of interesting point of view given when it came out in the world of gaming. And then they've kind of split off since then. They're kind of doing their own things now, and nothing really of note. One of them made that movie Mom and Dad with Nicolas Cage, which I thought was not that good. But
I forgot about that.
Get back together, Neville Dean and Taylor. Let's get Crank 3 on the docket. I adore the Crank movies. I want to watch them right now. Why am I still on this podcast? I need to go watch these things.
Go ahead. JD and I will cover it. We'll cover it.
We should do a Crank commentary. That's what we should do one of these days.
Sounds fun. Yeah. Neville Dean and Taylor movie series or something like that. I'm sure that would also get some listenership as well. I think Jay just left to go and watch Crank and Crank 2. And I was just going to ask if he had a preference between the two, but I guess it doesn't really matter. They're so extreme in their own respective way.
Yeah, he went to get the Blu-rays. For the audio listeners, he's holding
Crank
up the
2,
Blu-rays.
of course, is the superior product. That's uncut right there.
Oh, it's uncut. Okay.
All right. So if Jay just if especially on the audio side, if Jay just doesn't talk the rest of the episode,
it's because he's watching Crank.
He's left to watch those movies.
He's off
Chev
Crank.
Chelios.
I think you make a pretty good point about Jason Statham in those movies, though. At the very least, with regard to the first one, it might be his best performance ever, or at least like it might be between that and Wrath of Man. Of all things,
he's never had a better grasp on like what his ideal action star persona is, because he's really funny and he very rarely gets to be
in a very dry kind of way. Like and I think what makes his comedy work in those movies is that it's almost like they're trying to make him not self-aware of it, which is sort of the antithesis of how he plays his character in the Fast and Furious movies, which is very self-aware.
Knowing, wink, wink.
Yeah, and I think it was great at first, but it's gotten a little bit repetitive maybe as time has gone on. At least you can argue that. But there's something to be said about his ignorance to his sort of dryness. I think that makes it all the more charming, honestly.
He's like the king of this topic that we're talking about.
He
Like
really
most
is.
of his movies fall into this
Kinda
category.
do.
There are certainly there's some Mount Rushmore figures on there. You look at some of Stallone's like post Rocky stuff. He made a lot of junk. I mean, who else is there? I mean, if you want to look at like true garbage that doesn't really transcend being garbage, you look at Bruce Willis's 6,000 direct-to-video movies a year. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I feel like those are sort of in a
That's
different
different.
market. Yeah, it's a very specific market that I don't know if it's really in the same league, honestly. But going
Talking
back
about
to that
elevated trash.
elevated trash, we're inventing a new term here now.
Oh,
Oh
here
my
we go.
God. But yeah, as far as like action stars, maybe from that certain era, like you mentioned Stallone, for instance. I mean, maybe like a Jean-Claude Van Damme could fall into that category a little bit. Yeah, Seagal. Yeah, for sure.
All right, Brendan, what's the first one you want to bring up?
It's a good question. I think I'm gonna bring up one that's maybe more in spirit to something like Cocaine Bear, since that is the movie that is inspiring this conversation in the first place. And I know this is a movie that does have its own cult following, especially as a franchise and a saga. But I'm going back to the year 1990 to a film called Tremors. Which and I'm going with something that I think actually is a pretty good movie in its own right. I actually think what this movie is trying to do is just be a fun, campy sci-fi movie with giant worms in like a kind of a almost Western like way. And I think the charm of it is that it didn't seem like director Ron Underwood and screenwriters Brett Maddock and S.S. Wilson, it didn't seem like that they were trying to make a cult film. There actually is a sincerity to this one. And I also think from an acting standpoint, I think that Kevin Bacon and Fred Ward, the late Fred Ward, have amazing chemistry. You could watch this movie and take out the giant worms, and it's just an enjoyable movie about two dirty handymen in Nevada. I forget what state they're actually in. But there is a weird sense of like sincerity to it. And I think in many ways you can argue it's one of those movies that sort of kickstarted this whole fad of animal attack movies, sci-fi themed monster movies that really tried to achieve cult status before they knew they even had a cult film on their hands. And I think the subsequent films in this franchise still at least maintain enough of the charm, at least with the second and third film, by keeping what's his name, Michael Gross as Burt Gummer around. The first time I ever saw this movie, it was me walking in on it. I think my dad was watching it, and it was the scene with Michael Gross and Reba McEntire just unloading elephant guns on one of these graboids, I think is what they call them. And I thought to myself, I have to watch this movie. And I think it holds up. I think there's a practicality to it that is really great. I feel like I'm arguing more objectively about it. I feel like I'm being very serious as to why this is a good movie, but there are movies that can take the trash mentality and honestly take it kind of seriously. And I think this one succeeds very well in doing that.
It's all about like aspirations, right? This movie is not trying to be anything that's going to change your worldview or anything like that. They're just like, we're just going to give you a junky survival sci-fi animal movie.
Yeah.
And you're going to eat it up because Tremors is good. And I know there's stories of Kevin Bacon being on the set of Tremors and him just being like, oh my God, is my career over? Is this really what I've come to? I'm doing a movie about killer sandworms. And then now, it's like one of the things that people most like to talk to him about. So I think that really, that kind of defines this great trash movie. If you look at something on paper and you're like, oh my God, that sounds atrocious. And they managed to give it some sort of alchemical spirit where it kind of becomes something that is just so easy to embrace. And in that way starts to feel like something that you really personally attached to. I think that's the magic of these kind of movies.
in many ways, it definitely uses Jaws as inspiration.
Oh, yeah.
Because it really does put the characters first. What makes Tremors so good is the fact that pretty much everyone in the movie is just so freaking likable. And that's something you don't often see. I feel like sometimes the concept overtakes the movie, or the cult-like idea or the cult-like agenda overtakes the movie. And Tremors is the exact opposite, which is why I think it has held up so well over the years.
I agree.
And we all know Jaws and Tremors, same movie,
same universe,
belong in the same
universe.
Well, I've got a Jaws knockoff on my list if we want to just continue the trend here.
I think I know where you're going with that one.
I'm going Joe Dante Piranha.
That's not where I thought you were going to go with that. I thought you were going to go Deep Blue Sea.
That's on
wonderful
my list.
film.
Deep Blue Sea is on your list.
Yeah.
Piranha was such a direct Jaws ripoff that
it was, yeah.
They were going to block the release of the movie until Steven Spielberg saw the movie and was like, "Yeah, let him release that. It's good. I like that." It's this movie from Joe Dante who would go on to. He's kind of a junk guy, which is what I really like about Joe Dante. Like Gremlins is kind of, a really good version of what in many people's hands would be this really junky throwaway movie.
Yeah.
And Piranha is kind of that way too. It's made as kind of this spoof of Jaws, and it's like the pitch, I guess, to a studio would be, it's like Jaws, but we're going to give it that like late 70s, early 80s sex comedy vibe to it too. So it's going to give everybody what they want here. And it's just a really kind of clever play on what audiences were expecting from movies like that at the time. And also kind of just a fun send up of some of the kind of quirks of Jaws and the things that you can kind of nitpick with it. But it also has this clear reverence for that film. And, Dante and Spielberg obviously had a great working relationship moving forward. So that's a really,
those
really
were Amblin Productions, weren't they?
I
don't know if Piranha was, but I think
Gremlins was. Yeah,
Gremlins definitely
sure.
was.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure about Piranha. But I look at the filmography of Joe Dante, and he was a really interesting director until he wasn't. Like there's a point in his career. I remember. Yeah, well, I think about like my experience with his films. One of my favorite films as a kid that I will admit does not hold up for me very well is Small Soldiers. Which I think was like that's the first time I felt like he was almost trying to take himself too seriously, and maybe that was less on him and more on the material, more on maybe something behind the scenes that was forcing a specific type of film that was really just there to market merchandise and toys. And the movie, I think, suffered from that. But for a while, Joe Dante was a really interesting schlocky filmmaker.
He's made some great movies. Yeah, I mean the Gremlins films, The Burbs.
The Howling, wasn't that also
Piranha,
him as well?
Yeah, The Howling was him too. Small Soldiers, weirdly, I watched that like in the last couple years, and it.
Why?
I don't know.
Well,
I think I was kind of doing a little mini Dante thing. But I didn't get through all of them. But
of course you would. You would find any director just, I'm going to watch all of their movies.
I think Joe Dante is like a really, really interesting director. I mean, he's made some really good movies, and I think it was maybe after I finally watched Looney Tunes Back in Action, which is the Looney Tunes movie that he directed, which is
that's
really
a good. That's a good movie,
really good. And then I was like, oh, well, I'll give Small Soldiers a spin again. I haven't seen that in forever, and I had so many Small Soldiers toys growing up.
Same here.
I think before I'd even
played
seen
the video
movie.
games on PC. A lot of those like those active role playing games, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. I did rewatch Small Soldiers maybe sometime. It was quite a few years ago when I was still living in Kentucky with you, JD. And I watched it because at that time I was working in product marketing, and I remember much of that movie's opening is around the concept of product marketing and product management. And I was reminded of so much about what my job was at the time. And I was kind of shocked to see how the movie gets it kind of right. And then I'm thinking, why does this movie get it right? It shouldn't get it right. This is taking itself way too seriously. But it's like, it's interesting how that trajectory happened with a director like Joe Dante, who was included not just Gremlins, but even Gremlins 2, which is
Gremlins 2 is like so good. I mean, go watch Gremlins 2 again. I know it has this. Well, it's kind of come back around as
it's got a weird reputation.
Certainly a cult movie, but I mean, at the time, it was like a calamity. It was like, this is one of the worst movies I've ever seen. Unbelievable. This guy will never work again. Watch that movie again. That is a smart movie. And Small Soldiers, to me, when I rewatched it, I was like, this is just kind of like trying to grab the Gremlins magic that he just doesn't really have anymore.
It's just there for the toys, I feel like, which were well designed. I mean, they were fun, catering to the youthful me at the time when I first saw the film. I wanted to buy those toys. Yeah,
I had all those toys. Absolutely.
Yeah, Chip Hazard, Archer, all those good guys.
Yeah. Okay, so the first movie that I'm going to bring up here, I'm going to move away from Joe Dante and Small Soldiers, if you guys don't mind. And instead,
I'm reliving some memories here.
Well,
we're going to go to the world of Paul Newman. And we're going to talk about the classic Paul Newman film, one of his own very favorite movies, Slapshot. Is the first movie I'm going to bring up here.
Slapshot, really?
Slapshot. The Chiefs, baby. So
yeah, okay. This makes sense with JD over here.
Obviously, being such a big hockey fan, like this movie is a prerequisite to even play when you first enter the ice, even at the age of 5 or 6. You got to watch Slapshot. It doesn't matter if it's appropriate or not. You watch the movie, you play. And it's a really fun movie. It is absolutely absurd. You can't take the hockey seriously in any way, shape, or form, but that's also part of the charm of it. And it's doing it in a very different way than something like the Mighty Ducks, which maybe we'll talk about here in a second.
For a different reason.
This film is embracing hockey culture, at least at the time, and heightening it to such a degree where the comedy and the levity of it is so biting and absolutely hilarious. And I think it does it, like, obviously it's treating hockey with like this, it has like the satirical angle to it, but at the same time, I also think it's doing it from a place of reverence, which I don't think the Mighty Ducks films is doing. And that to me is the big difference. Slapshot, I don't think is ever making fun of the sport. I think it is taking it's a sport that allows you to do the most insane things in terms of human competition, including punching other people in the face. You can do that legally in this sport. There's not very many where you can do that. The
fights are monitored, but they're allowed. They're allowed.
Yeah, and I think it has such a lot of fun heightening all of that. So I've always had a fun relationship with the Slapshot movies, even though they are not good at all. However, I will say, and I haven't revisited these films in some time, but I did think about this immediately, Brendan, when trying to think of some movies to talk about here, because we talked about in our close review how the hockey depicted there is kind of tapping into a new trend within the hockey community as far as, toxic culture and toxic masculinity, and how the game is trying to weed all of that out. And make the game more accessible to other demographics that normally haven't been drawn into the game. And Close does that in a fascinating way. I say all that to say, when you consider Slapshot through that prism, I don't know how well the film holds up, even in the same, under the same guise of how we're having this conversation. It might be more of a cringy experience when you consider it through that lens, because Slapshot is admittedly kind of tapping into that toxicity that the game now is trying to weed out. So I know, like, when you take friends to hockey games that normally don't go, and they're invigorated by the hitting and the fighting and all that sort of stuff.
Sure. The
reality is fighting is almost out of the game now, especially compared to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the style of hockey that it was, that inspired a movie like Slapshot.
The enforcer.
There's no enforcers in the game anymore. If you do not have skill, you're not in the NHL. Bottom line, that's just not. Yeah. It's not the same game anymore, and so it does make Slapshot an interesting relic in that regard. It is certainly a wonderful mirror to what hockey was at that time, but through the lens of today. I don't know. I don't even know if you can have the same conversation we're having now when you're talking about it in a more, a more, what's the word I'm trying to think? Like when you're trying to talk about it in a more serious way now, in terms of rooting out a lot of the stuff that's just not good for the sport. Slapshot does play into all of that in a way that, I don't know. It just doesn't work now. But I haven't seen the film in a long time, so I don't know. But it was an interesting thought exercise.
Yeah. When did this come out? 1977, I think.
Something like that. I think it was 77. Yeah.
Yeah. Weirdly, the same director as The Sting and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Yeah. It's been a while since I've seen this. I saw when I was really young. There was a point in my life where I was really getting into like old sports movies for some reason. I think I saw this at the same time I saw the movie, of all things, Rollerball from 1975, which is yet another trashy movie. I'm not going to be talking about it here because that movie's just bad. I don't think that movie's Jimmy Kahn. But yeah, Slapshot I think I saw around that same time. There's a lot about it I don't remember, to be perfectly honest, but I think that makes it an interesting relic and one that certainly represents a snapshot in sports history, which is why if it doesn't hold up, that might be part of its charm then. It kind of representing the evolution or maybe even de-evolution of the sport, depending on what you want to look at it as.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, maybe it'd be something that I'll get to, sometime this spring because I'm going to have some downtime coming up here very soon. So maybe Daddy. This is one that I'll get to. In either way, because we talked about this a lot last week, Brendan, especially when we were doing our Ant-Man review, that I'm a big believer that most things fall in the middle, that there's a duality to everything, or most things. And it's very possible that this is a film that can be that relic, be emblematic of what hockey was at that time, and the fun energy that comes with the game at that time, and also be representative of why you needed to root out that same stuff, because when you consider things like CTE and the violence of the game, and hey, maybe punching another human being in the face over and over again just isn't good for their health or your health. Maybe that's not, and also
in a
maybe
sport that isn't about fighting and it's about putting a puck in a net.
Yeah,
and also there's boxing involved.
I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
Tyler Durden taught us differently. How much can you know about yourself if you haven't been in a fight?
Yeah. And also the skill of the players today is so insane that the enforcers of yesteryear, they wouldn't be able to keep pace. They just literally wouldn't be able to skate on the same ice as the players today. So I think it can be both things. I think weeding that stuff out is good for the game. Personally, I know some people want to keep that old school mentality of fighting and huge hits and all that sort of stuff. And, the physicality, the hitting, you want that in the game, but there needs to be parameters on it. I think the NHL's done a decently good job of that. And fighting should probably just become obsolete. It's really not necessary. And the best things of the sport today is the skill. You watch Connor McDavid, and it's like he's from another planet, and that's really fun to watch. So I say all of that to say Slapshot is a really fun movie. It's, one of the first movies that I thought of here. And along the same lines, because it's hockey and you think about how big these movies are, I also thought of the Mighty Ducks. And it's such a love-hate relationship that I have with those movies. On one end, I think they can be fun. They have an appeal and a lure. But on the other hand, I absolutely loathe these movies because I think they have no reverence for the game. So I think they fall under this camp of what we're talking about here today. And there is a degree of me loving those movies despite how bad they are because of what it meant for the culture, especially sports culture in the United States, and giving the game a voice that it really didn't have before. I mean, as a fan of the sport, I cannot deny the power of those movies in that regard, but also they're really bad.
Well,
and they
D2,
don't
baby.
treat the
I'll
game
stand up
with
for
any
D2.
reference.
There was this weird influx of like early 90s, maybe late 80s to early 90s kids-driven sports movies. And I don't know if it was maybe the success of The Sandlot that sort of kickstarted a lot of them, but weirdly, the Mighty Ducks have carried more of a reputation than other movies that I think have done it better for their respective sports, like Little Giants or The Big Green or something.
Yeah,
Rookie of the Year.
I really like Rookie of the Year.
I loved that movie growing up.
Yeah, I rewatched it maybe like 2 years ago, and it is still weirdly charming, mostly due to the young child performance with Thomas Ian Nichols, I think his name is. But again, I think these examples I just threw out there, they at least have a reverence for the sport that they're depicting from the perspective of children, you know, which was kind of the thing when we were children in the early 90s, at least most of us here. We were getting into sports a lot of the times because of movies like this, and they had a respect for them, and they had so much self-respect. The Mighty Ducks doesn't. And maybe that's really what made them so well regarded, because they actually have this deep-rooted cynicism. And I don't know if that was the intent, though.
I don't, my guess is it's not, because these are Disney movies at the end of the day. So I don't think they went into it with that mindset, but it's very clear they didn't have anyone on set or, you know, in charge of the production that knew the game of hockey. And so, you know, they just went into it just trying to, you know, elevate its, you know, I honestly, I don't even know what they were trying to do. I'm trying to give them more credit than maybe what it deserves.
They just ran with the physicality of it and made up their own rules in the process, is basically what they did.
My favorite part of hockey is when a guy in a cowboy hat gets a lasso and starts lassoing people on the ice. I don't know what to tell you.
Doesn't it happen once a season? I feel like
I was so mad. I'm almost seething now that you just even bring that up. It is so dumb. It is so, and that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Like it is not treating the game with any sort of reference whatsoever. And then of course, ironically, it's the only sports movie that I'm aware of anyway that launched a genuine sports franchise. Yeah. You know, the NHL puts out the Mighty Ducks in the early 90s based off this movie. So like, I don't know. It's such a duality with that
weird
movie.
Thing. It's a weird thing.
Anyway, what else you guys got?
That's a good question. I feel like everything else I have on my list is going to completely change the trajectory of this conversation from sports movies to really anything else. I might get some pushback on this one. I'm just going to throw it out there. I really don't care, but there are certain actors that you kind of have to associate with trashy movies nowadays, and I think one of them is Adam Sandler. But weirdly, I'm going with a movie that is a Happy Madison production that does not even feature Adam Sandler. I think Grandma's Boy is a pretty funny movie.
You remember the Grandma's Boy cult, huh?
Yeah, and I think I'm one of the few. I don't think there's really that many.
There is a hive. There is a Grandma's Boy hive.
I haven't found it yet, so if they're willing to welcome me, I'll join the club.
That was a massive movie at my high school, and in college too. I would say a lot of people watch that movie.
Well, college is the reason why I have such a reverence for it. It was a movie that my roommates and I at the time, most of those guys I'm still in touch with. A lot of them are still very close to me. And this was one of the movies that we watched one time, admittedly not the most sober, I'll say. But there was a lot about that experience that we do remember. And maybe that's part of the reason why I feel the urge to talk about it here. The movie is absolutely terrible. And I'm not even sure if it knows how terrible that it is. Like it is bad. It is really bad. And it wastes so many great actors like the late Doris Roberts, who plays the titular grandma. You also have the great Linda Cardellini before she really started to take off in her own right. It's not a good movie, but I don't know. The stuff that Nick Swardson sometimes says just makes me laugh. The whole I have to pee out of my ass line just makes me laugh. Whatever the heck that Joel David Moore as JP is doing as this nerdy robot guy, just I have no words for it other than I laugh. God help me, I laugh at this movie. It's trash, but I can't defend it in any other way. But this is the topic at hand. We're talking about movies that are indeed trash for one reason or another, and for some reason, I have to defend Grandma's Boy. It's just a movie that still makes me chuckle.
Okay.
You have your trash can. I have my trash can.
Everyone's got their trash can.
It's decorated in my own way.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not a treasure.
I love that. I mean, that was a huge film. I mean, I knew a lot of people who really liked that movie growing up. I find it grating, but
it is grating. I'm not going to argue that, but I weirdly love that about it. I have no words. I'm done.
Okay.
So let me ask y'all. Let me ask y'all a question on the philosophy of trash. Are the Fast and Furious movies trash?
Yes.
I think
I think so.
Agree. And I think the two creme de la creme trashter pieces of the Fast and the Furious franchise are actually Too Fast, Too Furious and Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift.
I would agree. I would agree.
Those are the ones that really have that scent, ode de trashois, if you will.
Yeah.
You know how, sorry to cut you off here real fast, Jay, because there's a reason that you chime in so fast when you, with that franchise particularly, when you pose that question. And I think it starts with the titles of these movies alone are ridiculous. Like they're so campy and there's nothing consistent about any of it. That alone is emblematic of trash. It starts there and then we can get into the movies.
I mean, Too Fast, Too Furious, one of the great titles. No doubt about it. And that one, that's a John Singleton movie that is, that's the one movie more than any of them that you could just kind of rip out of the Fast and Furious universe and it makes very little impact on the greater story of Fast and Furious.
Which is why I don't think it's the worst one. I
don't think it's the worst one either.
I think it's kind of middle of the road if you're going to rank them all just from an objective standpoint.
I think from a style standpoint, it's crazy. I mean, it is insanely shot. I feel like it kind of inspired an aesthetic to a certain point. Really, when you think about the Fast and Furious aesthetic, when you think about like Pimp My Ride, that's Too Fast, Too Furious. That's absolutely.
That's
great
Too
Fast,
point.
Too Furious.
Yeah, that is very true. That one seems to be very much. It's the most MTV of the batch, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%.
But that's what I really like about that one.
Yeah, and I love that about that one. And then with Tokyo Drift as well, which is the other one I'd throw in here. That one, it seems to me like they made that movie being like, yeah, we're just going to keep pumping these out for no money every single year. That's what the franchise is now. And then they kind of secretly made one of the more interesting entries into that franchise with that one too. And that one has become vital to the world of Fast and Furious.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
It's been
you
crucial.
You need to watch that one now.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I just think that one's a lot of fun. I think they really take advantage
like it a
of
lot too.
the setting and kind of stripping it out of that world and putting it with this, I can't remember the actor's name who's the main guy in that film who's in like
Lucas
Friday
Black.
Night Lights and stuff. Yeah, Lucas Black.
He's my
not
least
the greatest
favorite
actor in the world, but
I really wish, and maybe this is because where the franchise went, we look back at this film retroactively and we love a character like Han, but I feel like if he were the main character of that specific movie, I think it could have been even more interesting. There's a weird it actually has a weird thing on its mind that's really compelling about the idea of language barriers and cultural differences and how they actually communicate their language through driving and racing, despite not knowing each other's customs. But there's some kind of like shared aspect there. And I feel like that's mostly funneled through the character of Han, which is why I would have loved to see a little bit more of him. But obviously, that's not where that narrative goes. But yeah, like that, it's so interesting how that film has become so necessary in the entire franchise that it's weird to see how it's just been retroactively made better because of it.
Jade joked about this a few weeks ago, right? Or was this last week? I can't remember. But when we were talking about how who needs rules with this universe? Like, if you're biology, who cares? Like, science, get rid of it. Like, just we'll bring people back from the dead, not explain it or half explain it, and it doesn't matter. Like, that's the beauty.
Yeah,
of
they've
Fast
made
and Furious.
they've made quite a few superhero movies look like documentaries at this point.
Like, it's.
But see, I would say about that franchise, I would say those two to me, for whatever reason, and this is the intangibility of trash that we're talking about now.
Yeah.
Those feel trashier to me than like Fast 5.
Oh, Fast 5 is just a great movie. Like that's just a good like action movie, a good heist movie with a lot of action beats too.
So I don't think that one belongs on this list.
I'm with you. I'm absolutely with you on that. It's a better movie than the two that you're talking about for sure, but in the confines of this conversation, it's absolutely Too Fast, Too Furious and Tokyo Drift. Maybe to an extent the fourth outing, Fast and Furious, which takes itself so seriously that it does get a little silly at times, but I think that's more of an accident than it is the intent, which is why it might not qualify in the end. But yeah, those two, I'm with you. Those are the quote-unquote trashiest of the bunch.
I do want to push back a little bit on 5. It's, because it's one of those things, going back to what we said earlier, I don't know if the film was aiming for this. Maybe it was intentional. I don't know. But that's a movie where Vin Diesel flies through the air on the interstate as if he's Superman. And this is the first time
he sure does
in that franchise where, the physics of these films are already ridiculous. Now we're at campy levels of just absurd.
Fast 5 is when it becomes a superhero movie.
Yeah. And so like, again, like to your point, Brennan, in terms of like what constitutes a good movie, Fast 5 is arguably the best of the bunch here. I will not push back against that. That is a good movie, a good heist movie. I do really like it. I'm not saying that Fast 5 is bad or a lesser movie.
No, I know that.
I'm not saying that at all. But in terms of, do we consider it to be a dumpster whopper, if you will? I mean, it's going to really absurd campy territories here.
I think the idea and the concept is for sure, but there's maybe it's just the way I view it. There's something about the way Justin Lin directs that one that I think
that's what I was going to say.
Yeah,
it's got its acts together a little bit.
Yeah, but there's
the other ones are like
even when Vin Diesel and Paul Walker are dragging that giant safe throughout all of Brazil,
it's so insane.
There's a weird tangibility to that. Like when I see that happen, this is going to sound weird to describe any Fast and Furious movie, but there's an artfulness in the way that film is crafted where I don't quite see the trashiness when compared to something like Tokyo Drift. And maybe it's just more of an aesthetic choice or something. And
that's fair. I do think it's kind of trashy, but to what Jay said earlier, like there's a difference between trash, just fun campy trash, and then elevated trash. And I think they're on the elevated trash level. Like it is very good for what it is.
True
but
elevated horror. It's all about elevated trash.
Exactly. Like I just feel like this is a really good movie that also is insane in every single way. And again, like, was it aiming for that intentionally? I don't know.
I don't know.
It might not have been. It might be accidental, but that just adds more charm to it for me, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
I got another philosophical trash question here. I'm gonna keep them coming. Right, so we got Fast and Furious. All right, it's trash. Is Tony Scott a trash director?
No,
I don't think so.
Is it similar to what you're talking about with Justin Lin, where it's like
I think it's the
he's operating on a different wavelength than Trash?
I think it's all about aesthetic choices. It's the visceral quality that his films present. Any other director that maybe doesn't have that same visual language could turn those stories from Tony Scott films into elevated trash, if you want to call it that. So, like, if we're looking at just the scripts themselves and the stories they tell, then I think the argument could be made for yes, that they are.
He kind of makes junk material, but he turns it into a Tony Scott movie.
Yeah, but like a movie like Crimson Tide, for instance, has a real visceral quality to it. Like there's a tangibility to that movie.
Philosophical,
I think he's a very underappreciated director in that regard. That yes, his movies are very action heavy and they're fun and I don't know if silly's the right word. I think that might be inappropriate. They can't. Yeah, in certain cases, I think a movie like The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3 or his version of that certainly feels that way because of John Travolta, but there's a weird tangibility to the way his films look and feel and how they're edited that it kind of gives it like this griminess or this like dirty quality to it that I think maybe weirdly tricks you into thinking it's not trash. So I think that's maybe why
I agree with you. I think I agree with you. It's very subjective, this whole trash thing. I just want to throw it out there because there are like you look at like Days of Thunder is kind of junk.
Yeah.
But it's also like beautiful, very thoughtful,
like really well made though too.
That's
yeah. And
so
that makes for that makes for an interesting conversation that we could potentially have is where does that line get drawn and which directors are the ones that sort of, I guess, toy with that line the most.
I'm writing a book on that actually right now. So
I think it's a great topic. I think we can get some.
You can read it soon.
Let's get that edited.
Yeah, but then there's something like Top Gun, and maybe this speaks to what you're saying there, Jay. I don't know how isolated I am in this, but I will die on the hill. A glorious, violent, bloody death if need be. That while that film is fun, that is a biting commentary.
That's a serious
on
movie.
bravado.
That is
absolutely.
A serious
There is
movie.
absolutely nothing junky about it. It certainly carries the facade at times.
Oh, there's
plenty fun
junky
to be
about
had, but that is a really thorough and nuanced commentary on bravado that I think that the sequel takes advantage of in its own ways, which is why I'm very pro its nomination at the Oscars this year. But yeah, that original Top Gun is very good. Very, very, very,
but
very
you can
good.
also see a world where that is in the hands of Johnny Average Joe director, and it is absolute junk.
I agree.
Yeah. I think the closest that maybe Tony Scott has come to this type of quote unquote trash that we're talking about is maybe a movie like Domino, or maybe True Romance, the film that Quentin Tarantino wrote. I think.
What about Last Boy Scout? Maybe. It's kind of junky.
Yeah, but maybe it's because it's just such a product of its time. Maybe it's part of the I don't know. But I think Tony Scott's one of the most fascinating names with regard to this specific conversation we're having because he really does kind of straddle that line in an interesting way.
Well, you're right. Domino almost kind of feels like Neville Dean and Taylor-y kind of trash.
It gets close. It doesn't quite have the off.
The
I mean, it is kind of off-putting in its own way, but it's not not in the same way as something like Gamer, for instance, which you brought up earlier.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is maybe lesser Tony Scott, and maybe this is a little nostalgic. Jay, you and I think it was you. We did our nostalgic blinders, that top 3. I think it was episode 396. I was looking at it a little bit earlier today, and one of the films that I had listed there in my honorable mentions that I always really liked, I saw this in high school, was Spy Game. I always really liked that movie a lot. And that might be a nostalgic blinder. I haven't seen it in a while. I don't know how well it holds up, but there's something about, because earlier, Brendan, you mentioned like the grimy, dirty aesthetic that he brings. Like there's still like this there's like an interesting tonal texture to his movies, and I think that's very much there in a film like Spy Game that have always really liked. Similarly, Enemy of the State kind of has that same thing.
But then it's like, can it be junky if it's got Brad Pitt and Robert Redford at the middle of the movie, right? Like Gene Hackman and Will Smith, are they making trash?
I don't think so. Like, I would argue not. I really like those two movies, and maybe we can debate the overall quality of them. But even if they're lesser Tony Scott movies, I don't know if I would ever label them as trash in the sense of what we're talking about here anyway.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah.
Glad we can settle that one.
Yes. We have a good segment to cut out here, JD, that you can just post on YouTube. The whole Tony Scott debate here about how this relates to trashy movies, if at all.
Exactly. Well, speaking of trash, there is a franchise that I want to bring up, and I understand that this is very much a JD thing, and you two won't agree with this as much, and that's perfectly fine. But this is quintessential JD. We were eventually going to get to this moment in time when I bring up the Bayformers.
Oh boy.
Well, I knew
because
Michael Bay was going to come up
bad.
in some way.
These are not very good movies, but I grew up on Transformers, right? It was in its heyday when I was a young kid, and I grew up on, not just the TV show, but of course the toys. You guys were talking about the small soldier toys earlier. I didn't have those, but what I did have was Transformers. And I played with them relentlessly. And then I got into the comics as I, grew into my adolescence. And so then I was, when I was Sam's age, my son's age, I was addicted to Transformers. It was my thing. And then Beast Wars comes out, and I became even further addicted, which is why I'm so excited for the new movie coming out, because it's inspired by Beast Wars. So then Michael Bay decides that he's going to do a live action Transformers film. And at that time, what I had really loved with Michael Bay, because maybe as this conversation goes, we can get into the Bad Boys movies, because goddamn, I love those films as well. And so
I like Bad Boys too. I like Bad Boys too quite a bit. That almost made my list here.
I did too. He's coming off the heels of Bad Boys 2 when he starts to do Transformers. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm like, Michael Bay, heck yeah, I'm totally all in on it. And then, as time goes on, the Transformers movies aren't very good, but what I do like about them are the Transformer-y kind of things. So, when we're talking about, the Autobots and the Decepticon characters and how they're rendered, and, how different they are from the comics, how they're updated given the technology at the time. Like, I found all of that fascinating. I had God knows how many conversations just talking about that element of those movies. I could still have a full conversation just talking about that element of those movies. I do really like it, and I have a lot of fun with them, as bad as they are, especially the second one, which, to be fair, was written during the writer's strike at the time, so there was never any script for that movie. They were just shooting as they went.
Worst movie I've ever seen in a movie theater.
Which is perfectly understandable. And it's really funny. I was actually having a conversation with my wife about this the other day, because our neighbor just got a new car, and what she got was a Chevy Volt. It is so hilarious to me. You could tell that they were making the second Transformers on the fly, right? They were just getting money wherever they could, because the production was a disaster given the Hollywood chaos at the time. There is a character in the second Transformers, an Autobot, that just shows up halfway through the film without any explanation whatsoever. He's actually kind of pivotal to the ending of the film from a plotting perspective, but it is never explained, like never brought up. His name is mentioned once, I think. But it's a new character that just shows up halfway through the film. Not in the first film, not in the beginning of the second movie, just shows up halfway through. And it is a Chevy Volt, which was new at the time. And they're like, we got to throw that in there. Yeah. This is what we're talking about with, Michael Bay embracing advertising.
Yeah.
It's just so ridiculous.
Whether Chevy Volt or Bud Light.
Yeah, it's so funny to me, and so like there's just things like that I appreciate, and so I can have fun with these movies. I think the third one kind of is borderline good. I think it's the best of them by
one
far.
Transformer. I didn't grow up with the property like you did, JD. So I go into these Bayformers movies with a more distant mind, I guess.
Sure.
The third one, Dark at the Moon, is the only one I think. This one's actually kind of fun. This one I can actually get behind for the most part, and it's that one time where I really thought even the family dynamics between Shia LaBeouf and his two parents, I thought this is actually kind of funny. And I don't know why. And maybe it's because it has Patrick Dempsey in it, at least in certain parts, and I think he's just so charming. So I don't know. Maybe there's just other factors there. I don't know.
Well, I think with Dark of the Moon, it's the only one of the Bayformer films where there's a script that's trying to actually tackle a seamless story. The first one is sort of there, but it's so discombobulated and disjointed. And the editing of that first film is just bizarre. It's really weird.
It's a tonal thing, too. Like, if you didn't grow up with Transformers, if you watch that first one, it's like this weird like dichotomy between a serious sci-fi thriller and then a Cartoon Network TV show. Like the second that the Transformers themselves start talking, it's like you change the channel. It's a complete. It really does feel that way.
It is. There is a little bit of an odd dynamic there that I became accustomed to. Like, you just kind of have to embrace that's how these films are going to function from that perspective. But the third film, I think they finally found a way to make that pretty seamless. And then in terms of its dramatic stakes, it's the one that has the most heftiness to it. And you couple that with the script that is the most coherent of them. And there's some actual emotion to that film that isn't completely manufactured like it is in the first two movies.
Yeah.
And maybe also that is Shia LaBeouf's performance, because it's the only one of the three where he's clearly giving a shit. The other two, he's just there for a paycheck and he's having fun.
He also
and then
has
that third one. He's giving a little bit of effort, so I think that comes through as well.
He also has way more chemistry, if you ask me, with Rosie Huntington Whiteley, I think her name is, when compared to Megan Fox. I think the chemistry is way better in that third film.
Megan Fox, God bless her, very shoehorned into those movies and just there for Michael Bay to objectify for obvious reasons. And then the other part of these movies as well. So there's the Transformers element of it that, ties nostalgically to my childhood. The other element of these movies ties into my identity at the time, in the sense that, and this is going to sound a little silly because we're talking about Transformers, but I was in college at the time. And so I was starting to form the roots of my cinephiledom. And what I've really come to love about these Transformers films, aside from the robots and the transforming and the fun of that for me, is Steve Jablonsky's score, which is so good. It is the same argument that we had a few weeks ago when we were talking about James Newton Howard and some of the scores he did for Shyamalan and how they don't deserve to be in those movies because they're really bad. And yet, in the Last Airbender, he scores a masterpiece in a film that does not deserve it.
Yeah.
Jablonsky is somewhat of the same thing here. Like, his scores for those movies are phenomenal. They're really good. The main theme that plays throughout all three is elegant. It is absolutely exquisite. Almost doesn't belong in a movie about robots transforming. And then in the third film, there's like the urgency and what he adds to the action, I think is really good in terms of action beats, action scoring. There's not a lot of scores that I think do better than that. So when we're talking about isolated crafts in these action films, like a lot of the action films we've gotten over the last 20 years or 15 years, a lot of them are not very memorable, but I can think of very specific cues in those Transformers films that I still listen to today that I think heighten a lot of what's happening in those movies. Jablonsky doesn't get nearly enough credit for what he was able to do with with Michael Bay and
the movies don't really deserve them, but they're really good scores.
Absolutely terrific. I would recommend them like outside the context of the film. Like if you just want to listen to something on Spotify, absolutely listen to them. They don't sound like Transformers scores. They don't sound like they come from that kind of movie. At least not all of the tracks.
Yeah. Well, Michael Bay is one of those directors that certainly fits into this category as well. He's, I mean, we mentioned Bad Boys 2, which is a film I almost thought about bringing up for this list as well. Really, if not for just the that one car chase where they are literally throwing bodies at the cars. It is so distasteful, and yet it's kind of why I think that is one of Michael Bay's best movies. I certainly like it more than the first Bad Boys, which I think is, I'm not the biggest fan of the first one. But that second one I think it's so mean and so ugly that it's just kind of have to respect it.
It's insane. And
it's gross. It's so gross.
I know. I mean, I do really like the first one. I like both of the Bad Boys though, more so than the Bay-isms of them. It really comes down to the two leads of that franchise. They make that more than anything else, you know, because to me, like the quintessential bad boy moment of all three of those films, I think to this point, is the highway chase in the second film.
Yep.
Where from an action standpoint, you have Michael Bay doing what Michael Bay does best, for better or worse.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely ridiculous. They're throwing cars, and it's, you know, from an octane perspective, there's a lot of energy to be had there. And then the whole scene keeps cutting between that and this dynamic between Mike and Marcus where they're just yelling at each other the whole time. And it is downright hilarious. I am laugh out loud laughing in that sequence. And where the stakes are dire, they're literally life and death stakes. And yet it's very hilarious. So yeah, I mean, the Bad Boys movies, I will champion them all day. Those are my elite, exquisite dumpster whoppers. That is the dumpster filet mignon, as Jay was bringing up earlier. The Bad Boys movies for me.
Love it. Chev Chelios and the Bad Boys hanging out at dumpster first class.
I'll see that shared universe. I'd be first in line for that.
Yeah, absolutely. What else you guys got?
I don't know that I have anything that I really want to dig into too specifically, but I'll just throw out a few. Shoot 'em Up from 2007 with Clive Owen. I don't know if
I've not
seen that one.
Never seen that one.
Clive Owen, Monica Bellucci, Paul Giamatti, action movie. It's basically like a cartoon. It's absolute trash. Not very successful, but I watch clips of it occasionally just because I think there are some really good pieces of that dumpster fire. Crawl from just a few years ago.
Yeah.
Really loved that movie. That was such a fun movie. Alexander Aja, just, you know, that's a movie that knows that it has this cheekiness to it, but doesn't go out of its way to kind of let you know that it's in on the joke. It strikes a perfect balance of tone, I think, there. And then, obviously, you know, nostalgically, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Yeah.
Gotta love it.
Yeah.
Bloodsport is a fun junkie movie.
Oh yeah,
going back to Van Damme.
Thought about that one. Yeah.
And as far as some contemporary ones, I freaking love Extraction. Movie's so much fun. It is so racist, but it is so fun, in spite of its very, very questionable choices it makes at certain times in that film. Unhinged, my main man. Bloated Russell Crowe looking enormous in that movie. And that movie is so much fun and, again, pretty off-putting. And then the last one, you can go 1,000 different directions with Liam Neeson, but the recent one that stuck out to me was that movie Cold Pursuit. I liked that one.
Yeah. That one had a weird self-awareness to it. Like that was sort of this quasi-comedy of sorts. Yeah. And you know, it's interesting you bring up Liam Neeson because one film I was going to bring up is directed by a guy that has worked with Liam Neeson quite a bit in many movies like Nonstop and Unknown, which can also qualify for this list. But was it Jaume Collet Serra? His first major film.
Guy.
The Rock's new guy. For better or for worse, mostly for worse, if you ask me.
Mm-hmm.
But back in 2005, he did a movie called House of Wax that I think kind of rules. And mostly due to how surprisingly artful and awesome the art direction is. Like, it's actually a very well made and thought out movie with some really gruesome kills.
He's a good director. Did he do Orphan?
He did do Orphan, which also
that movie is like looks good. Like has some really
it's a really well crafted
flourishes.
piece of trash. It really is, and
Yeah.
it kind of falls into the same category as well. I almost could have talked about that for the same reasons, but House of Wax I think is a really fun movie. It's surprisingly well made. But a few others I had here. There's this one horror movie I saw almost a decade ago. In fact, it is almost a decade old, and I'm not sure if you guys have heard of it. It's a movie called Grabbers. It came out in 2012. It's an Irish film, and the concept is really what sells it. And I do think the film plays into its concept mostly well enough, but the concept is so fun in its own right that it sort of saves the movie. And it's basically about a bunch of blood-sucking aliens that invade Ireland, and the people of Ireland on this Irish island here, they realize that these aliens are not able to withstand. They're a host. Like they basically work as like human hosts of sorts, but they can't survive in a human body that has a certain blood alcohol level. So these Irish people have to get really drunk in order to survive. Like that is perhaps one of the greatest concepts I can think of for a movie like that, and it sort of saves the movie and makes it really interesting. So a movie like Grabbers was one I almost thought of. I had a few comedies here that I have a weird soft spot for that are also trashy, certainly in a different league than something like Grandma's Boy, but I have a soft spot for Hot Tub Time Machine.
Okay.
I maybe it's the reverence that movie has to 80s hair metal, which is also weirdly nostalgic to me. So I again, maybe it's the self-awareness of that one that sort of saves it too. And then keeping to that music theme there, at least the reasonings there. 1997 saw perhaps the biggest ripoff of A Hard Day's Night by the Beatles, and that movie was Spice World, the movie about the Spice Girls. Terrible movie, but admittedly, my fiance and I watched it together maybe some months ago. We laughed a lot. Was it intentional? I don't know. I don't know if the movie was doing something smart with any of that, but I weirdly think that, at least I've noticed, there is this weird cult following or this weird reappraisal for something like Spice World. I have noticed some critics that we follow that have started to defend it even more vocally than it perhaps was received at the time in 1997. So that certainly doesn't defend it, and it's not my way of saying everyone out there should go and watch it again and certainly reappraise it, but there is something interesting about that one, and I did find it kind of funny.
All right. Yeah, that's really fun, really interesting there. As for a few more that I have here on my list, I have The Boondock Saints, which is not a very good movie, but I love the performances. I think it's a lot of fun. And the music, the soundtrack, I think is really great to that film. Free Willy is a nostalgic one from my childhood, but I really like that one quite a bit.
I watched the first like 15 minutes of that recently. I forgot that the kids just like, do they just live on their own?
I think so. I don't know. I can't remember.
I think they live in like a little skate haven.
I need to rewatch Free Willy.
Yeah,
because last I remember, I thought I remember
Great
that being
soundtrack.
like I thought I remember that being like a legitimately good movie. Like, doesn't that hold like a 79 on Metacritic or something like that? Like that's a pretty high score, at least based on critics at that time. In what, 1994? When did that come out? 1993.
Yeah, it
maybe?
was early 90s. Well, that's interesting because my memory of it isn't. Again, if I was looking at this from the lens in which I view movies today, if I was to write a review for it, I don't know if I would be all that positive. But it's one that I really liked. But to your point, I need to revisit that film. I have not seen it in literally 20 years.
I think
Free Willy series. Let's do it.
Yeah, I think so. I think at the time, I don't know why I have this buried in my memory. I think Roger Ebert gave it like almost 4 out of 4 stars when that came out, Which
maybe I'm misremembering. I don't know. I mean, I obviously really loved it as a kid. I just didn't think that it would hold up all that well. Like
I wouldn't be surprised
anyway.
if it does. I wouldn't be surprised if it does. Like there are a lot of these kids films from back in the 90s that just had this weird dose of sincerity and honesty that you don't see as much anymore. And maybe it might retroactively seem better. I don't know. But I'd be curious about
stars
that.
from Raj. You're right.
3.5. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll trust him. We'll trust him. But I need to revisit that film apparently. So. At any rate, a few others. I mentioned earlier, Deep Blue Sea has always been a fun movie for me as well.
Good movie.
On that aforementioned episode, I mentioned earlier that I did with Jay. We talked about our top 3 nostalgic blinder movies. One of the films that we talked about, in fact, we did a whole review of Batman Forever. So that's one that I wanted to bring up here because that's a movie that I don't think is very good, but I love that movie so much. It's so ridiculous and over the top, and
I want to see the 3-hour cut of that. Apparently, there's a 3-hour cut somewhere that never got released.
I know. I want.
So curious about that.
Yeah, the Schumacher cut. Jupiter Ascending is what I have here on my list. That's a movie that is maybe the Wachowskis' worst. I don't know, but there's something so insanely endearing about it to me. Like it's so bad, but I have fun. I don't know. I don't know how else to explain it other than that. I also have written down here the National Treasure movies. Maybe that's similar to Free Willy. I don't recall them being all that great, but I have a lot of fun with them. Some good memories with those.
I remember
movies.
them being fun.
Yeah. And then the last one I have here that I'll just mention here real fast. This is a 2013 film starring Colin Farrell. And Colin Farrell, I think, had an underrated year because he was in the Walt Disney movie that came out later in the year, in which he gives one of the best supporting turns of 2013 in that film. Saving Mr. Banks, but he was also in an action film earlier in the year called Dead Man Down that isn't very good, but I, for similar reasons to Saving Mr. Banks, ended up really liking the film because of his performance. And there's something about what he was channeling at that time of not being in these great films, but giving his all and transcending the material, and that was one that's always resonated with me. I've always found that film to be a little underrated because of his performance. Narratively, it's very trite. The action is, it's very typical. It's not bad, but it's not great either. Why that film resonates is because of Colin Farrell. He's very, very good in the movie. So that's one that that came to mind for me as well.
He is a good actor.
Good
actor indeed. All right. Well, with that, let us know how any of your picks stack up against ours. Email us InSessionFilm@gmail.com. Hit us up on social media. And if you disagree fundamentally with this premise, tweet Jay because this was his idea, and that's the hill I'm dying.
That's at Mr. J. Ledbetter. Bring it on.
Go
again. I say trash reverently. I like these movies.
Yeah, I did my best to convey that. Clearly, I failed. So I'm going to let Jay in charge of our Twitter account over the next week. So be on the lookout.
I think that's a recipe for disaster. No offense, Jay.
Coming for you, Elon.
Brendan, we got to talk about coffee. It's
the most necessary thing in any adult life.
Absolutely necessary, especially if you're a parent like myself. You live off coffee. It is a vital part of your life, and
otherwise you crash and burn.
Yeah, and you don't want to skip out on the quality because it just matters. I mean, you can have terrible coffee and you get the same effect, or you can get the caffeine and the energy boost that you're looking for, or if you just enjoy the flavor, the taste of coffee, you obviously want to invest in something that is extreme in the quality category. And that's what's great about Coffee Cult, right? Because they don't skip out on quality. Everything they do is of elite stature. They use specialty grade Arabica coffee beans, and they do not accept defects. A lot of coffee companies will take specialty grade coffee beans and also defects, which cheapens the coffee and the price, and that's how they can get around giving you a lower price, but the quality's terrible.
I was going to say it affects the taste. And those of us who drink coffee as regularly as we do, we don't want to sacrifice taste. There's an art to the taste of coffee, as you're talking about there. And I certainly agree with that. It's honestly something that we really want in our coffee. We want to taste the differences. We want to taste what is artful and unique about how these beans are being processed. And the great thing about Coffee Cult, and not just the specialty grade beans that they're using, as you say, but they only source from farms that pay their workers fairly, especially women. They pay them fairly and equally, so that they're being worked on and sourced from a great source, and that's really awesome to see. Their orders, that if you want to place an order for them, they're all roast to order. They do not ship stale coffee that's been sitting around for days and weeks, because that's the last thing that you want. What you receive is as fresh as it can be, and you can tell by that final product the second you start drinking it.
Absolutely. Yeah, they do not have coffee just sitting in some warehouse, waiting for you to order, and God knows when it was roasted. Yeah, they wait for you to order. It is roasted, and then it shows up at your house. So it is very fresh.
So it's free of any preservatives or anything like that. So you don't have to worry about those
chemicals.
Yeah.
No chemicals whatsoever. They do not believe in that as well. So you're getting natural, great premium coffee, and some of it is quite exquisite. So I had the Brazil last week. On the website, they note that it has notes of dark chocolate and walnut, and I adamantly will tell you, you can taste it.
That is my kind of coffee right there. Anything so dark roast like that has that kind of aroma and aftertaste, that is my thing.
It is incredible. So I definitely recommend that as well. So yeah, I mean, you have to try Coffee Cult if you're a coffee drinker. It's ethically sourced, as Brendan's talking about. It's roasted to order, and they just don't skip out on quality. So it might be a little pricier than Folgers, which tastes like garbage. Don't
get me started on that.
You're getting the Ferrari of coffees. So you got to go check it out. At checkout, use our code ISF. Again, that's ISF. You'll get 15% off. Coffeecult.com. At checkout, use the code ISF and get 15% off. The InSession Film Podcast is brought to you by our great friends over at First Time Watchers. And Brendan, on this episode, we were talking about trashy movies that we love. Emphasis in reverence. We say that with love on our hearts.
Yeah.
That's something that the First Time Watchers have done their entire run. That's what they're known for, is talking about these movies.
It's sort of been their ethos in some ways, and they've made themselves sort of known for that, and they certainly wear it on their sleeve. They're very proud of that status.
They are very proud. It's what makes them unique. On their latest episode, they talked about The Yellow Sea, a 2010 Korean thriller. I don't know if that falls under trashy movies that we love. It could be great, genuinely.
I don't think it does. I mean, we certainly talk about Tim and his love for Gerard Butler and Geostorm, and that certainly qualifies for sure. I don't think this one does. It's a movie I'm admittedly not too familiar with, but that's what makes their show unique, is that they'll discuss not just those trashy movies that you're talking about, but they'll even talk about other movies like this, as long as it's something that they've never seen before, which gives it a really fresh perspective. And we didn't even get a chance to mention, it's not just Tim Casa, but it's also Walter and Hermano talking about these movies in their own way, and they have a very good dynamic.
They do have a great dynamic. And now that I'm looking at the poster for The Yellow Sea, it does appear that it premiered over at Cannes in 2010.
Probably not trashy then.
So probably good, I would imagine, or at least some some level of excellence to
level
that
of
movie.
prestige, and maybe in a loose term. I don't know enough about the film, but
yeah,
I mean, who knows?
Yeah, I probably should have looked that up beforehand, but sometimes you just drop the ball on those things.
It is what it is, man. It is what it is.
But yeah, these guys have some great recommendations. I definitely urge you to check that out at the end of their shows. Brendan, where can you find these guys on the internet?
Well, as you can see by the link scrolling down at the bottom of our page for those of you watching on YouTube, but for those of you listening, you can find them at firsttimewatchers.podbean.com, and that is spelled as First Time Watchers, FIRST, not numerical first. Once again, firsttimewatchers.podbean.com. But you can also find them on Twitter at First Time Watchers, also on Instagram at First Time Watchers, and on Facebook by simply searching First Time Watchers.
And go subscribe to them on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. Let them know how much you love them. Leave a review at the end of your review. We ask that you leave a little hashtag so they know that that we sent you to them.
Yes.
And this week, let's go with the hashtag Trashy Podcast that we love.
I love it.
Really appreciate
that.
Yeah,
I love it.
So go leave them that review, leave them that hashtag. Go check them out again. That's First Time Watchers. All right, let's do a little Q&A here. I have a question for you guys. So the night we are recording this is the SAG Awards. I have no idea who won. But in the spirit of award season, there was a couple of questions that I wanted to throw out to you guys. And this first one is a question that I know we've covered on the show, broadly speaking, before, but I wanted to, to go over it again, at least here a little bit, because, we have a new format. We're now doing this on YouTube. I know we have some new listeners and viewers, but I wanted to ask you guys about your favorite Oscar nominations, maybe ones that surprised you or ones that have resonated and held up over the years more than a lot of others, because the next question I'm going to get into deals with legacy. I was on a podcast earlier today, guesting on another show where we talked about that legacy in the Oscars and, being nominated or winning an Oscar. Is that good or bad for you? I do want to get to that here in a second, but on the flip side of that coin, what are some that stand out to you that you think have actually stood the test of time very well, that you've really come to love?
Oh man, I mean,
yeah, that's
hard
a great
knowing right
question.
off the top of the dome. I mean, the ones that immediately jump to mind to me are wins that I can remember. In the first one, for whatever reason, it might just be because I got this poster over my shoulder here, but I was thinking about the win that Ex Machina got for special effects.
Yeah, for effects. Yeah.
And I thought that was just such a great one kind of bone to throw or recognition to give to a movie of that size and of that kind of intellectual accomplishment. Just the willingness to point out, it doesn't have to be, especially in today's film landscape, right? Like, that movie doesn't have a ton of special effects, but the special effects that it does implement had to be perfect for that movie to be as good as it is, and they really did that. And I think, to me, that's so often the awards get bogged down into the most of something rather than the actual best of something, and that is one of the greatest examples of the best winning rather than in the face of the most. The best really won that year. So that's just the one that comes off right off the top.
And I think that's a great one because there is a subtlety to that. I think that's why the visual effects are so good, because you don't really notice them. Like, there actually is something very tangible and organic about it. And it's kind of a surprising film to win a category like that, which have usually gone bigger. That's usually a spot reserved for some commercial blockbuster or something like that. But yeah, JD, this is a really daunting question you're posing, because
it is.
I sometimes don't often associate Oscar wins or at least I don't look at Oscar wins in the same way that I look at maybe just simply getting an Oscar nomination. Sometimes just getting the nomination is sometimes all I need to feel at peace with a certain film that I love, that I think needs to be respected. And I feel like we're in a day and age where now there are certainly more daring, smaller films that are getting recognized in ways that usually wouldn't. Maybe, let's say, in the 90s or the 2000s, let's say, there was certainly a period in that time when movies like The English Patient, for instance, was certainly an Oscar player. And I'm using quotes around that. But at that time, there were a lot of critics that still really liked that movie. It was just a certain mentality, a certain way that people responded to these grand and lush and literally romantic movies. And there is still a time and place for that, but the vibe has changed for something a little bit more intimate, tangible, daring in its own way, which is why this might be a bit of a obvious example, but a movie like Moonlight winning Best Picture is so shocking. Like I would never have seen a movie like that win many years ago. And was it my favorite movie of that year? Maybe not, but I'm glad a movie like that could win an award that coveted, because if that same string of nominees for Best Picture was represented in, let's say, 2005, for instance, La La Land would win every category. I mean, it's just that it's more so that kind of movie, even though it does have some modern flourishes that still fit within the framework of 2016. But a movie like Moonlight, I think, represents the shift in that perspective most literally. And I guess maybe I'll go with that one because I think it's just more of it just feels like such a time capsule win for our current day and age. And
for sure.
And that's kind of why I really respect what that film represented there.
Yeah, and there's certainly a larger discussion to be had because obviously Moonlight doesn't win without the controversy surrounding 2014 and 15 specifically.
Right. Yeah.
And certain campaigns launched against the Oscars those years. And that makes Moonlight all the more fascinating because, it's a movie that was made on like $2 million. What else to win the Oscars? That's unheard of.
I tend to, when it comes to Oscar wins, I tend to respond more, I don't know if positively is the right word, but I tend to remember the ones that are the most, I guess, shocking, or maybe not shocking, but the ones that don't seem to, I guess, portray the status of Oscar winner. A movie like Moonlight has it feels very different. Even back in 2007 when No Country for Old Men wins Best Picture. That is that's not the kind of movie you would normally associate as a Best Picture winner. It's a very certain kind of movie. And I'd probably pick that movie as well for very similar reasons. I think it's sort of started to represent a transition and a change, which is always interesting in the world of movies here.
For sure. And to quickly speak to one that stands out to me, actually, I do have two that I want to mention here real fast, and to unveil the curtain a little bit further, because part of why I wanted to bring this up, and you're right, Brennan, this is a little bit of a daunting thought exercise here, and this is worthy of a full conversation. So perhaps this is something we can have in the next few weeks as we get closer to the Oscars. But I mentioned I was on another show talking about the Oscars for 1977. So the films of 1976. And nominated for Best Picture that year is Rocky, All the President's Men, Network, and Taxi Driver. 4 films that hit the culture in a significant way, and are considered to be, among the best movies ever made. The 5th film nominated for Best Picture is Bound for Glory, which is a movie that you literally cannot find. The only way to watch this is if you find a DVD at your local library or you Jack Sparrow that movie. That is the only way to watch it.
Amazing.
And it's a movie that, because I threw out, the question on Twitter as well, like to rank these 5. And most of the responses, almost all of them, and I got a hefty amount of responses, and most of them had Bound for Glory ranked last. And if I got responses that said that I haven't seen this movie, it was almost always that movie. So people are either ranking it last or they simply haven't seen it. Now, there might be some political or business schemes, behind the scene that we don't really know as far as why the distribution for that film just doesn't exist and why you can't find it anywhere. I don't have all the details for that. But I wanted to bring it up because I did watch it over this last weekend, and I think it's actually pretty good. Now,
okay.
If it's a movie that if I was also ranking those 5, I probably would have it last. But I think it's actually pretty good. I think it's better than something like a Coda, if you will. And again, I say that with love to Coda. I'm not trying to
you
trash
like that movie
Coda
quite a bit.
But when we're talking about Oscar winners that, or even those nominated that maybe shouldn't be there or arguably shouldn't be there, Bound for Glory, I don't think is one of those movies. Could you have replaced Bound for Glory with a Carrie, for example, or something else from that year? Maybe. But I'm not upset that film lands at that number 5 spot. I actually think it's pretty good. I don't know if this is true, but I would not be at all shocked if the Coens said that they used that film as inspiration for some elements of Inside Llewyn Davis. I think there's a lot of comparisons to be had there.
Interesting.
With those two
Make
movies.
me want to watch it now.
And and it's a 2-hour and 20-minute movie. It's very methodical. It's its central character is much like Llewyn, and he's a little prickly, which I do love. So there's a lot of really good things about that film, and it just made me think about these movies that maybe at the time they're not raved about, or maybe they just hold up better over time. I think Bound for Glory is one of those movies and could be even further one of those movies if it got distribution. But people just don't have access to it, which is half the problem here. But
when it comes to Best Picture specifically, I think it's a really interesting conversation that we can spend hours on regarding, is it a movie that represented only a specific snapshot at that time of cinematic culture, political culture, social culture, whatever it is, and which ones are also, looking ahead, which ones kind of become a bit more forward thinking in that regard, that actually do have a very significant place in the evolution of film history and critique and filmmaking. And a lot of cases, movies that get nominated that are very daring at the time don't end up winning Best Picture. A movie like Apocalypse Now, for instance, which was nominated but doesn't win. I think it loses to The Deer Hunter, if I'm not mistaken. But we look back more fondly on a movie like Apocalypse Now as perhaps being one of the best movies of the 1970s, simply because nothing came out like it at that time. And it's interesting to separate those two dichotomies. And it's also interesting to think, like, when you award a movie Best Picture, you're not giving the award to a movie that you think is going to have that same power in 10 or 20 years. You don't know that. If you did, then so many movies that never even got nominated for any Oscars at all would be winning Best Picture all the time. Like, if you knew those things, like a movie like The Shining would have swept the Oscars in 1980.
It's the argument for doing these things like 10 years later.
Which you have always stated, like, let's do the Oscars for 10 years down the road. I think that makes a lot of sense, honestly.
Like a retroactive look at movies that have changed over time and how the Academy feels about them now, I think is a really interesting exercise.
I completely agree. I think there's a lot of validity to that. But that's the thing with the Oscars, it's certainly not the be-all, end-all of anything. Yeah. But it sparks for some fascinating controversy. I guess that's a good segue, though, to the second question I wanted to ask you guys quickly here as we wind things down. Of this year's crop, like, how do you foresee these movies in another 10, 15, 20 years? Are they a Bound for Glory, if you will, or do you see them resonating as, we just talked about with the 1976 crop, as one of the best lineups we've ever seen for Best Picture? Is this in that conversation? Where on that spectrum do you see this year's crop?
It's hard to say because they're so top of mind for us now that I want to say that there's
project. It's hard. Yeah.
I do think there are a handful here that we'll still be talking about in about 10 years. I think we'll still be talking about Top Gun Maverick. I think as far as just commercial blockbusters are concerned, I think in 10 years, we'll still be talking about Tom Cruise, which means we'll inherently still be talking about Top Gun Maverick. So I think that's just sort of an obvious pick, but I do think a movie like Everything Everywhere All at Once will have some staying power, whether it wins Best Picture or not. I mean, we have to also wait and see what ends up winning Best Picture, because that could maybe prolong.
This might be a little bit premature.
I know, but let's say hypothetically Everything Everywhere All at Once ends up winning Best Picture, which means we're going to see a lot of negative backlash, as we always do for any Best Picture winner. That could, in many ways, help prolong the conversation and keep it in the zeitgeist for a longer period of time. And I'm not certainly advocating for that sort of negative response, but it might, sort of prolong that a little bit further. But I do think a film like that, I think, of course, Avatar's still going to be in the conversation because we'll see more movies in that franchise. But I think, a movie like Everything Everywhere and Top Gun Maverick, those will certainly still be talking about for sure. As far as the rest, I don't know. I mean, a lot of these filmmakers who have movies nominated for Best Picture this year, they're still going to be working. We're still going to see movies by Martin McDonagh, for instance. So we'll probably still be talking about The Banshees of Inisherin just among cinephile circles. I don't know how that'll correlate to audiences in a general sense, though. It's a loaded question, but I know there will be at least a few that I hope we'll still be talking about in maybe a decade or so.
I would say my opinion on Everything Everywhere, just kind of living in the little sphere that we live in, you see the reaction on Letterboxd and you see the reaction on social media to that movie. I think 10 years from now, that will be a foot in the door movie for a lot of people doing the stuff that we're doing now. Like, I think kids who saw Everything Everywhere All at Once in high school will think of that movie as a stepping stone movie into a world of cinephilia for a lot of people. I think that movie is going to sustain in one way or another. If it wins Best
the
Picture,
way Pulp Fiction was for our generation,
or maybe The Matrix.
In a way, in its own way, certainly not to that scale. Those were massive, and culture was just different at the time. But on a much on a micro level, And then I think if it does win Best Picture, there's going to be a lot more hate than it would receive from other sides of the sphere. But I think that one will be remembered. Top Gun's going to be remembered. I mean, you look at the films, a Spielberg movie will always be remembered to one extent or another. Avatar is such a hugely successful film. Although if you ask half the people in the world, nobody's ever seen it and it hasn't left any impact. Meanwhile, it's made $5 billion at the box office.
Yeah, for sure.
But I do look at some of these, and no disrespect to these films, because I like these films. Women talking, nobody's going to be talking about it. Triangle of Sadness, I don't think anybody's going to be talking about it.
I think that one will fade.
All Quiet on the Western Front is going to just kind of fade away into the abundance of war movies that have been made recently. So I think there's like 3 or 4 in there with some real staying power, and we'll see the Tars of the world how that sustains.
Yeah,
I have no idea.
Tar I think is maybe the biggest enigma of the bunch. I could see that going either way. I can see that getting forgotten, or I can see that being, because it is such a despondent and challenging movie, I can see that one like growing with time, depending on how well it's seen and the distribution of that and how well that it carries. But that raises another question about the distribution of these movies and how that has changed when compared to, our youth, for instance, because you mentioned a movie like All Quiet on the Western Front. And I think one of the big reasons why that one might not have as much longevity is not just because it's a war movie, like you mentioned, but it's also a movie on Netflix. And I think it could become maybe inadvertently buried because of the plethora of content on that streaming service. And streaming services themselves will, they'll prolong certain movies. They'll block certain movies. Not that they're trying to, but it just will. It's just the nature of how the market continues to change. And some have to rise up to those challenges. And I don't know if some of these will.
Yeah. It's going to be real interesting. I think for All Quiet on the Western Front, see, now that's unfortunate, Jay, because there's a level of me where I want to agree with you. but also I think it's one of the best World War I movies we've ever seen. So
yeah, I love that movie. That was in my top 5.
Yeah, my hope is that it's still very much in the conversation, but I do think ultimately you're probably right, especially because it's on Netflix and it's just going to be buried there for God knows how long. Everything Everywhere All at Once, I think, hinges on whether it wins Best Picture or not, which it does seem like it's going to, since it won PGA and DGA, and who knows? I don't know if it won SAG tonight, because we're recording as that's going on. But it is the front runner to win. If it wins, I think its legacy is going to be hurt in terms of the overall discourse that surrounds that movie. But I do think there's a world where if it loses, it has a La La Land-esque legacy where the conversation around that film has changed quite drastically after it lost to Moonlight. And if Everything Everywhere All at Once loses, I think
it won SAG, so watch out.
Okay, so
it did. Okay,
I mean, it's going to win Best Picture, so I don't even know why I'm projecting like it's not. It's just going to win, and it hurts my heart because I do think it's genuinely one of the best movies of the year, and there's just going to be a sect of the internet that despises it because it's winning awards against something else that they love, whatever that may be, and that's really unfortunate because the reality is art isn't. It's not black and white in that way. Selfishly, I want The Fabelmans to win because, one, I love Papa Spielberg. I think that film is also deserving of Best Picture, and it's already a little bit divisive. People either love it or they find it kind of middle of the road, and I don't think its legacy will change one way or another. I think that is the trajectory of that film no matter what. Yeah. And if it wins, it also spares Everything Everywhere All at Once at the same time. So that's my selfish hope. But we'll see. I
think at this point,
is going to win.
If we're going to turn this into an Oscar predictions portion of this episode, I'm really feeling like I'm about to bet money on Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yeah,
I gotta say that was not the thought I had leaving the movie theater after watching that movie. This is going to be the movie that wins Best Picture?
It's kind of. I feel like that's a pretty common reaction these days, though. Like I didn't feel that way about Parasite. Coda, Parasite, even Moonlight to a certain extent. There was a point in time, maybe like the late 2000s, early 2010s, where most film critics, when they were putting their list together for the best films of the year, very rarely did they say the best film of the year is the one that ends up winning Best Picture. There was always like this disconnect between how they felt about movies and how the Academy felt about movies. And I feel like there's way more synergy now, and it's kind of by accident. And I don't know if it's maybe members of the Academy changing, new demographics coming in, people of different backgrounds voting in a different way, and maybe that's certainly a part of it. But there definitely seems to be a little bit more synergy than I've certainly come to expect. And it's interesting. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just it's really interesting to see that happen now.
Yeah. Well, there's an abundance of reasons for that. I mean, just the foundational changes within the industry as far as what gets made kind of silos them off. But yeah.
All right, real quick, Brendan, let's get to the results of this week's poll.
It's real bad. Okay? I don't like those numbers at all.
Just one poll? Those things aren't scientific.
Yes, they are. All this is science. This is math.
So for this week's poll, we used Cocaine Bear as inspiration, a trashy animal movie. And it's a film that we will have a full review of coming up pretty soon. Myself and JD, I believe, will be the ones talking about that in just a few days. So stay tuned for that. But using that film as inspiration, we asked all of you, what is your favorite animal attack movie that isn't Jaws? We threw that specific disclaimer out there because I think most of us would agree Jaws is the best one. But winning the poll at just over 27% was a Jaws-like movie anyway, and that was Deep Blue Sea winning this poll here.
There we go.
Is a film I do kind of like. I think that film is
favorite.
a lot
I
of
love
fun.
it.
Yeah. In second place, we actually had a tie between our write-in option. We got 4 write-ins specifically that I'll talk about later. But as far as the options we listed, another water-themed movie came in second place, and that was The Shallows, the film with Blake Lively, which I think is pretty effective. I think it's a pretty effective thriller. And in third place, we had a classic, Alfred Hitchcock and the Birds coming in third place there at just over 13%. Fourth place was Lake Placid, a very silly, trashy movie and a great performance by Betty White in that one. That one got over just 9% there. And then we also had one vote for 3 additional films, and that was Open Water, The Gray, and Crawl. But yeah, Deep Blue Sea coming in on top. Not too surprised. I feel like that one has grown in cult status over the years, and the cast is just so good. And Samuel L. Jackson's surprising death scene, I'll simply say, I think people still remember to this day. So yeah, it's hard not to be surprised by that one winning.
Yeah, good stuff. LL Cool J, I believe, in that one as well.
And his pet bird.
His pet bird. Yeah, some nice comedic moments there. All right, yeah, that's not too surprising. Very, very fun to see the results of that play out.
I will say, as far as just some quick write-ins here, we did get 4 write-ins here, but it was for 4 specific movies, so only 1 vote for each of them. But most of them I haven't even heard of. There's a movie called Alligator. Haven't seen that. There's also a movie called Razorback, which got a vote. There was, for the most recent movie, Beast, got a vote here in the write-in option. And the last write-in option here, pretty inspired pick, Disney's Pinocchio, the 1940 Pinocchio. Now, specifically the whole, the whale portion of that movie, which is only maybe 5 to 10% of it. But, if we're talking animal attack scenes in movies, then maybe there's definitely more to talk about there for sure.
Okay. All right. Very good stuff there. Thanks to everyone that voted on the poll. We really do appreciate it. We're going to get out of here. Do want to plug that next week we are going to be talking about something sports related or boxing related with Creed 3 coming out. So we'll leave Jay to the details for that because he's very good at coming up with clever titles. So we'll be talking something along those lines, and we'll have a review for Creed 3 coming out very soon as well. We'll have a review for Cocaine Bear. So stay tuned for that. We also have one more announcement. I'm going to leave it to you, Jay. What are you guys starting this week? A little fun action you guys are doing.
Movie series are coming back.
Yeah.
Trash. Wait. Forget about the trash. We're going back to the prestige, and we're going to be doing the films of Wong Kar-wai. Kar-wai. So be on the lookout for that. That is going to be starting this very week, if everything goes to plan. So be on the lookout for that. We're going to cover all 10 of his films. Yeah. Get excited. Boom.
And what's the first one you guys are doing this week?
As Tears Go By, I think.
As Tears Go By? Okay.
That is his first film. That would make sense. Yeah. I'm really excited to keep up with this one as well. I'm going to try and join as many of those reviews as I can. I know it'll mostly be you and Ryan, especially when you get to In the Mood for Love, which is a movie that JD and I did review in the main show some time ago. We did, So it'd be great to get your perspective, you and Ryan specifically, on that one.
Saw that one on 35mm just a couple weeks ago. What a day.
Man,
masterpiece.
Very jealous.
Masterpiece. Masterpiece.
Yeah, that is a very, very good movie. So looking forward to that. Be on the lookout. Ryan and Jay coming back with the movie series. And I can't wait to jump on a few of those myself. A few blind spots that I'm going to be able to scratch off here. So I'm very, very eager for that. I also want to plug Women in Session. They just got done doing a back-to-back of classic romantic comedies, and then they did contemporary romantic comedies as well. It was a lot of fun. Go and check all of that out as well. And I'm sure we'll have some Oscars content coming out very soon because, that's a week and a half away. About 2 weeks away. So,
jeez,
that is on the
It's already March, isn't it? Oh my, almost March at least as we're recording this.
Yeah, which speaking of, I'm going to be gone for a while. I will be here next week, I think. Maybe. We shall see. And I'm also planning the week after that. And then it's a crapshoot. I don't know. I'm going to be gone for a little while because baby number 2 is on the way. So,
and that'll
I'm going to be out for a few months.
I was going to say a little while, equating to what? A few months, at least like 3 months or something like that, right?
Yeah, it's going to be a little while. So these guys will be holding down the fort. I'll still be active on social media, but
Little Optimus.
Yeah, little Optimus. Yeah, cannot wait for that. Be sure to follow us on social media, subscribe here on YouTube and on the podcast, and we will see you all next time on the InSession Film Podcast. Go see Slapshot. It's great.